We probably have 3 acres of Frontenac ourselves. And the vines are
Oh
probably
wow.
some of the oldest because they were planted in 99. And so we're at like overall the average age of our vineyards for Frontenac itself is 22 years old.
You're listening to the Vint Podcast, bringing you expert interviews, alternative market insights, and exclusive access to the world of wine and spirits investing. Enjoy the show.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vint Podcast. My name is Brady, joined as always in studio by Billy Galanko. Billy, how you doing?
Greetings. Doing well. Had a great weekend and pumped for the week here.
Nice. Yeah, my wife worked all weekend, so it was just me at home, which means that I was doing like yard work and those kinds of things. So I wasn't guzzling a lot of wine, but I organized all of the like RTDs, like canned cocktails and stuff that I had in my house, and we have like an unreal amount of
Bubble butt.
yeah, bubble butt. That's right. Yeah, Andrew's bubble butt wine from our alien wine episode. I do have multiple cases of that still because he sent us like a truckload. But yeah, then I have a bunch of like whiskey cocktails, like canned whiskey cocktails, and then obviously like seltzers and things like that, which I'm kind of a sucker for a little bit sometimes in the summer.
Nice. Yeah. No, we had a bit more adventurous weekend. We went on a mini road trip, but before we went into that, you guys will hear in a future episode our interview with John Szabo, who's a master sommelier from Canada, and he's basically the world expert in volcanic wines. So I was inspired by his conversation last week. So on Friday, we had a few wines, but one that Maggie, my partner, actually picked out was a Klong wine called Vulcan, which Klong is an Austrian kind of natural wine producer, but they source these grapes from Hungary, which are pretty cool. So the two grapes in there was Harslevelu and Juffark, which I'm sure I'm not pronouncing those 100% correct. But I recommend anybody go look up Hungarian wines, number one. They're all great, but a lot of them are on these volcanic soils. So that was a really, really cool pet nat. Somlo in general makes really beautiful white wines as well, if anybody ever goes to check them out. But then we drove up to San Luis Obispo, which is in the Central Coast, kind of just south of Paso. So we drove through Santa Barbara County, tasted along the way. We stopped at Lo-Fi, which is basically Mays and one of my favorite natural wine producers. They have a tasting room partway up there in a little place called Los Alamos. So we did some tasting there, which was pretty great, and went to kind of also the main goal of the trip was for her to see wildflowers. We have a super bloom going on. It did rain all winter, but the result of that is fields and fields of flowers. So that was pretty cool. But our last little bit of wine piece was we went to a sparkling wine like lounge in San Luis Obispo, and they had flights of different champagnes and sparkling from around the world. So we got one that was a mixed flight with it actually had a Loire Valley pet nat from 2016, which was really interesting. You don't really see aged pet nats like that. So that was cool. Had a lot of depth. We had a traditional Cremant de Loire, and that flight also had a Blanc de Blanc champagne. And then we had one flight of just champagnes. One was Blanc de Blanc, and the other two were more Pinot Meunier heavy. They were a mix of multiple varieties. One was the 3 kind of core champagne varieties, and then the last one was mostly Pinot Meunier, but it also had, it's just Meunier. I'm kind of that anal stickler, and now I'm going back on myself. But it also, the last one had the three of the other varieties that you can also add into champagne. Most people only know Meunier, Pinot Noir, and Chardonnay. This one had Pinot Blanc, Petit Meslier, and Arbonne. I think Pinot Gris is also allowed. I'm not sure if there are other obscure ones, but that's one of the few wines that I've had that actually had more outside the core 3. So that was really cool.
What's the difference between like a pet nat and a like traditional method, like champagne, in terms of ageability and stuff like that? Like, why don't we sell our pet nats? Like, what keeps it from being able to withstand some of that aging?
There's a lot of things. I mean, number one, pet nats are not traditionally, but are more recently, the ones you see on the stores are made in a very natural style, very low amounts of added sulfur or anything. That would basically, they're more living. That's the whole point. And when you put It's also known as ancestral method. So when you put a pet nat in, it's still fermenting. You didn't take out any of the yeast. You didn't take out a bunch of the stuff. Whereas the secondary fermentation in a sparkling wine, at the end they disgorge it. So they shoot out all that yeast and everything that was living in there. So even if it all didn't die, it couldn't restart. So a few of those elements are really what prevent them from aging. But a lot of it is, along with the yeast that makes the bubbles in a pet nat, there's other stuff that could eventually keep going in the bottle that make it kind of taste weird.
Could it get like volatile, or I guess, or just like bitter tasting maybe?
Yeah, you could have, acetic acid and stuff in there, turn it kind of more into vinegar. You could have latent Brett do something. There's a bunch of different compounds that can absorb the fruity components or potentially continue, fermenting and producing off aromas. So you have to have the right conditions, the right grapes, kind of the right makeup for something to be able to continue to age.
Yeah. Nice. You were sending me a couple of different articles and things by way of wine news. Do you want to touch on some of that?
Yeah. I think something we will probably start doing more moving forward will be like a wine news segment. I think it's, something we have to keep up with anyway for work. So I think it's just fun to share. So I'm going to run through 5 or 6 quick articles here that I found really interesting this week. The first one is champagne continues to boom in the U.S. The results just came out from 2022. Total value in the country was down a touch from 2021, but 2021 was by far the biggest year ever for champagne in the U.S. market. We remain the biggest export market for champagne, which is interesting. But while total value was down, volume reached an all-time high last year. So it's kind of just continuing this trend of sparkling wine throughout the world. This was mirrored with the Cava sales that just came out, which also showed that they had their biggest year ever. And that's just not in the U.S. market, it's globally. But there's this continuing trend for people to really be attracted to bubbles, which is something I think we've talked about a bit before on this podcast as well.
So if volume was up and value was down, does that mean we are consuming cheaper sparklings? Cheaper versus, I guess maybe if most of that market was made up of champagne, just say, I guess that means more people are drinking, Cava, Prosecco, other forms of sparkling maybe.
Yeah, so that was champagne. That was value champagne. Down. Okay. That was exclusively. And I think we've touched on this with a couple other folks we've interviewed. Actually, the Glass of Bubbly guy. And we're actually going to have, we're recording this week, I'm not sure when it'll be released, Peter Leem, who is the global expert on champagne, coming on soon, so stay tuned. But what we don't really see as much here as they see in Europe is affordable, lower priced, but still high quality champagne, made in the traditional method. Yeah. So what they raved about in this article is that Americans are starting to really understand there is high-end prestige champagne that can be used for celebration, but then you can also have champagne and treat it like a regular wine, have it on the weekends, which is a big goal of the Comité and the marketing organization for all of Champagne. So that's pretty cool.
So are these bottles in the $25 to $40 range? Because I can't remember the last time I saw a champagne under $43, low 40s.
I mean, it doesn't say exactly in this article. It's pretty high level. What I'm probably thinking is that it was so concentrated on the very high end, the Cristals, the Tête de Cuvée, where maybe now it's, more and more volume is being consumed, sub $100, maybe closer to that $40, $50 price point. But, it is hard to find many that low.
I was even thinking about Veuve Clicquot, which is what is it? Maybe $65 a bottle even. And I feel that's a huge go-to for grocery store champagne.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on where you live. I know when you were in Virginia and we walked around a wine store together, I saw Ruinart for $60, whereas here in California it's $90. There's a range for us in the $40 to $55 price point. Definitely more when you get above 60. So I don't know, but I'm just excited that people are treating it more as just not purely celebration. I think there's a lot champagne has to offer. So, on that same note, something I also learned about champagne this week and Moet and Chandon just released their the bottle, the design for King Charles's coronation coming up here. I think it's in May or something. It turns out Moet and Chandon had been doing special edition bottlings of champagne for every coronation of the British family since, looks like 1902. We just all forgot about it because there hadn't been one for 70 years. So there you go. Apparently you can still find some of Queen Elizabeth's coronation champagne online. So, I mean, who knows? But that's kind of cool. And I think, King Charles is going to be pretty old. So we'll probably see another bottling here in, 15, 20 years, maybe. I don't know. I don't know how long he'll live, if he lives as long as his mom or outlives her. But that's something cool. So keep an eye out for that. Maybe snag a bottle if you're a big Anglophile. And then moving on, outside of bubbles, something that's close, near and dear to my heart, which I wanted to bring up. There was an article in the drinks business titled, "Could Zweigelt be the new Pinot Noir?" For those who don't know, Zweigelt is a red grape from Austria. It's basically a really light, high-acid, fruit-forward grape that's delicious. I really enjoy it. And what the article is trying to say is that since Pinot Noir, especially Pinot Noir from Burgundy, they've had a few lower harvests, smaller volume harvests, as well as prices just going up in general. Maybe at that lower entry level, people looking for a high quality, light, higher acid red, Zweigelt could potentially fill the void.
Yeah, it's like trying to think of what to liken it to in terms of the market. Like where else? Like thinking about premium. Like,
well, I mean,
light-bodied reds.
I mean, it's kind of similar, I guess, to a Gamay, but it has a little bit more depth and spice. But it's not as serious as like a Blaufränkisch, which is something other people might think from Austria. Have you had many, or?
I haven't. More, well, like Gamay was what was in my mind initially.
Yeah.
In terms of comparison, or I was thinking maybe like, I don't know, like Pinot Noir, but from like Italy, like in terms of style, maybe.
Like a Pinot Nero. So, interestingly enough, Zweigelt, and this is getting a little bit nerdy, but Zweigelt is a crossing of Blaufränkisch and Saint Laurent, and some people say Saint Laurent is a crossing with Pinot Noir. So it could actually have roots in Pinot Noir. But it's one of those grapes that was actually created in a lab. It used to be called Rotberger, then they named it after Zweigelt, Dr. Zweigelt. But there's some consternation around that because it turns out Dr. Zweigelt collaborated with the Nazis during World War II. So they were like, maybe we shouldn't call it this anymore. So people are
proper calls for consternation.
Yeah, for sure. The funny part was I can't remember exactly the year, but they named it Zweigelt like decades after World War II. It's like this was kind of known, and like nobody really knows why they made the change. So there are some like grassroots movements to either go back to Rotberger or come up with a better name because Rotberger does not sound good to English speaking countries. So
yeah.
But
hopefully,
amazingly great.
Yeah, hopefully someone named Cabernet doesn't ever do anything wrong.
Well, I mean, this one
world would be in shambles.
Well, this one was actually made by that guy.
Actually, named after him. I guess.
Yeah. So, but no, but people should really check out Zweigelt. They make amazing rosés that are actually like high acid, nice and like lean. I really like rosés made from them personally. But they also make great red wines, and they typically tend to be in that like $15 to $20, maybe $25 price point. So they're really attainable and they're great quality. So I think it can, be the next Pinot Noir, but we'll let other folks do that. And then two last quick things. Orange wine. Everybody knows I drink natty wine on the side here. A lot of those wines, those natural wines, are orange wines. You would actually appreciate this. I had a sommelier buddy in New York recently. He posted a picture of, he lived in New York, just a bunch of trash bags piled up in an alley. And he captioned the post, "Our natural wine shipment has just come in." So he thinks they're trash. He actually, I posted a picture and he's just like, "Oh, are you becoming a natty wine boy?" And I was like, "Well, I drink both. I like everything." But this is not a natural wine. This is a historic wine. Terra Alta, which is a denomination de origen, or however it's say, de origen, in Spain. A DO is basically their geographical classifications where wines made in those regions that follow certain rules can have the name like Terra Alta DO on their label, have just come out with a skin contact or an orange wine designate for the area. So that goes along with their red wine and their white wines that they can make there. But the interesting part here is it's not just, they didn't just hop on a trend. They've been making skin contact wines for hundreds of years, according to this article. But they're just making it official so that they can have the DO's name on any of these cool or interesting orange wines that are coming out of the area. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, it seems like, we'll definitely get that at some point in the U.S. Some more designation around, natural wines and orange wines as a category, especially in like Central Coast, probably.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, it's
like Santa Barbara.
Different though. Yeah, but it's different because like a lot of European appellations, if you're made in a certain area, you have to follow those rules to be able to put the region on there. Whereas in the U.S., as long as all the fruit comes from, that AVA, you're fine. So
you don't think there'll ever be like an additional labeling convention or something like that? Probably not.
There might be around like production methods, like they were trying to talk about like organic or Demeter biodynamic, but right now you're not labeling style based on your AVA in the US.
Sure. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I guess when you say natural wine, to me, I think about like process and production and stuff like that more than I think of like style.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't have conflated natural and orange or skin contact because they're completely different. But I think it's cool to see these regions that have been making these wines in this way for hundreds of years, like being able to be like, look, like you guys like orange wine now, cool, we have it and it's really interesting, rather than just some of these folks who are just whipping out like a weird wine that spent 5 days on the skins calling it orange and they're like, we're gonna make money. So I love to see these old regions getting some shine.
For sure. Yeah.
And then last but not least, Cyprus just put 22 million euros over the next 5 years to grow their wine industry. So shout out to Emily Saladino, who oversees Cyprus wine tasting for wine enthusiasts and was on the podcast. I think that was just pretty cool.
Pretty cool stuff. Yeah, for sure. That's awesome.
All right. Well, shall we get to our interview with Mr. Keck?
That's right. Yeah. David Keck is a friend of the podcast now. This is his second time on. You get to be a friend of the podcast after 2 times on an episode. So I think he joined us about this time or maybe a little bit later last year. So, we'll be on an annual cadence with him. But David is a master sommelier. He's based in Vermont. Has a project up there called Stella14 Wines, where he serves as obviously the owner, founder, winemaker. Doing some really cool stuff with hybrids, trying to combat the sometimes difficult climate in a place like Vermont to grow grapes. But yeah, doing well. We covered a number of topics across his projects. Obviously, talking about the hybrid varieties as well. Some of his plans to expand. We covered a lot of different topics, and he's always a good guest.
Yeah, it was great to catch up. I had a call with him, I don't know, early in the Vint days, where he was like very nice and he connected me with some of his friends in the industry to talk about how he could expand. So that's kind of how the relationship started. And then he came on the pod, and now Brady's going to go visit him in October or September. I may go too, not at the same time. But yeah, if a little bit more background. I mean, he was an opera singer. He ran many different wine programs, both in Texas and in New York, before deciding to make the move and become a winemaker. So really fascinating, well-rounded guy. He's now leading the charge for like recognition and I guess more funding for the wine industry in Vermont. So we really do run the gamut. We also touch on a grapevine that I walked by here in Los Angeles that I was going to try to save or prune. It's in a community garden. It's enormous. Like the vines now stretch like 20 yards. As soon as I was going to go prune it, it rained every Saturday, which is when the community garden's open for like 3 or 4 months, or not months, weeks, but it felt like that in LA. So I kind of forgot about it. And then by the time I walked by recently, it had sprouted already. Like it had a little bit of bud burst, but then that cold weather kind of knocked it back. But then I saw sprouts out again, basically bud sprout or bud budding. Bud break. That's what I'm looking for. And for those who know, like I don't know that much about viticulture. I know enough to get by, and that once the sap starts flowing and the buds start breaking, if you start chopping off limbs, it causes distress to the plant. It opens it up for disease. So it's just
you
not.
Gotta let it go now.
next year, yeah, I'll just wave at it and say hi. Harvest the grapes. Don't let the birds get them. I guess. Sad.
Well, and speaking of, you brushed over David, kind of pretty involved with the like winemaker societies and like organizations in Vermont, and I know that we talked briefly about them proposing official designation, I believe for the Champlain Valley vineyards in Vermont. So I think that process is still ongoing, but it sounds like they'll probably end up with an AVA, or I guess an AVA is what the sort of designation that they're going for, which would be cool because it'll be the first in Vermont, which is really, really great for the industry. Will bring a lot more credibility to the labels and the wines there. So it's awesome.
Yep. So someday we're hopefully going to get to try the wines, but in the meantime, Brady sent him up some Maryland wines, which he enjoyed. So cool. Yeah. Well, all right. Well, here, I guess you wanna lead in, or you want me to do it this time?
Yeah. Thanks everyone for tuning in to another episode. Here's our interview with David Keck. Hey, David, thanks for joining us. You're now a friend of the pod. I think we've been doing this long enough, and you've been on before, so we can start saying things like that.
Repeat offender. Nice. No, thanks for having me back.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, but as we mentioned, maybe most of our audience at this point, since we interviewed you now almost a year ago, pretty close to the time, I think. I remember I was moving last time we interviewed, and I was staying in an Airbnb, like in a little bedroom when we did the interview. But why don't you tell our audience a little bit about yourself, how you got to where you're at now, through your music career and also winemaking?
Sure. Yeah. Music career too, huh? Okay, going back. So
Quickly.
Yeah, sure. In the Reader's Digest version, I grew up in Vermont, and then went and lived in New York, and did my undergrad at Columbia in English and Comp Lit, and then went to the Juilliard School for operatic performance and was an opera singer for a bit. Did my master's down at Rice, brought me to Houston, where I changed career eventually and went into wine as a sommelier. So I was a wine buyer for a few restaurants, opened some bars, opened a honky tonk, cheese and wine shop, kind of ran the whole gamut. I worked in distribution for a little bit, became a master sommelier in 2016. And then in 2020, decided to return home to Vermont with my partner Lauren, and who's also from the Northeast. And so we decided in January of 2020 that we were going to move, which was a really interesting time to make a moving decision, turned out. And in March, we were sort of terrified that we were going to get stuck in Texas. So we decided to leave town. And so packed up a moving truck and moved to Vermont, where everything I had sort of lined up potentially work-related fell through, and the place we were going to live fell through, and we were living in a hotel in Burlington because I couldn't go to my parents' place because they're both over 70, and we were afraid we were going to kill them with COVID because we'd just driven across the country, and that was like, everybody was wearing gloves, nobody was wearing masks, very weird time. And anyway, in June of 2020, the vineyard at Boyden became available, which is one of two of the oldest vineyards in Vermont, and became available for lease. So with nothing else kind of holding us back, took over that lease, began pruning because it hadn't been pruned, and got about 30% of it done, and made the wine in 2020 at Shaxbury's old facility in Vergennes, Vermont. And yeah, produced about 450 cases of wine. And then 2021, we didn't have a great place to produce the wine because we decided driving grapes in the middle of harvest an hour and a half each way was really awful. So we we decided not to do that. And 2021, we sold the grapes to other producers in Vermont. And then in 2022, we opened a tasting room and produced our vintage that's coming up in our barn, which we insulated and converted into the winery. So, and I spent the morning out there disgorging some of our wines, and yeah, that's kind of where we are. Whew.
Nice. That was very fast. I didn't mean to rush you. I meant to say like you didn't have to go too much into it. That was perfect. You want to talk about just quickly some of the cool, unique grapes that you work with and kind of the style of wine you're making? Because I think it's different from what most people are thinking.
Yeah, for sure. Vermont's a really challenging place viticulturally. It's very different than a lot of the rest of the sort of standard and traditional wine growing world, just in the sense that we get really cold and it's relatively humid. So we work with cold hardy hybrids that were developed, most of them at the University of Minnesota, and some other viticulturists, mostly in the Midwest, who developed hybrid varieties that are basically crosses between Vitis vinifera, which is the traditional species of grape used to produce most of sort of standard fine wine, crossed with grape varieties that are native to this climate that can sustain negative 20, 25, negative, even negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit without just dying, which is kind of, for the most part, vinifera does. Even the coldest Riesling and Pinot Noir and things like that that are built for cold climates, they might not die, but you just end up constantly restarting trunks and trying to get back to some sort of wine-worthy production. So we work with 3 grape varieties called Frontenac Noir, Frontenac Blanc, and Marquette. Frontenac Noir and Frontenac Blanc were developed in the 90s. 96, they were sort of released for propagation and are crosses between a bunch of different things, most of which have numbers. And then Marquette is kind of an exciting grape for a lot of us up here, and I would say a lot of people in cold climates are working with Marquette. Its ancestry goes back to Pinot Noir. That's kind of the famous ancestor that everybody quotes, but there's about 50 grapes in between there and where we are now. But it's very Gamay Pinot Noir-esque. It also has the ability to kind of get pretty ripe in a cool climate. And all of the grape varieties up here maintain sort of high levels of acidity because of the cold climate. So, and the grape varieties themselves. So in the interest of kind of managing that without actually adjusting acid or messing with the juice too much, we produce a lot of sparkling wine. So in the Pétillant Naturel or Pet Nat style. So that is essentially for us, they're wines that finish in the bottle. So for those that drink more beer, it's kind of bottle conditioned wine, if you will. And I think they work really nicely with these grape varieties because they have that beautiful high acidity, which is much more sort of acceptable in sparkling wine. And so the model for a lot of our wines is Lambrusco, which is a region famous for producing sparkling, dry, and sweet, actually, red wines. So we produce a lot of bubbly, dry red wine that pairs really nicely with like pizza and prosciutto and hamburgers. And, you know, they're not, I would argue they're not the most like sophisticated or complex wines in the world, but they are, we think, very tasty. And people seem to enjoy them. And I think there's a lot of potential with the grape varieties to make some pretty complex and interesting wines. But we're kind of focusing on wines that, for the most part, are ready to drink early and are pretty sort of crushable, if you will.
So, are you bottling anything still right now, or? And if so, what,
2 still wines.
You know, are they single variety or are you blending?
Yeah, we produce, well, we're actually producing a still rosé this year, although even the rosés have a lot of color to them because the grape varieties themselves, the red grapes, are just so dark. And the skins have a huge amount of anthocyanin, a color giving compound. So we tried to make rosé, but we don't have equipment that can press fast enough to get it off the skins fast enough that it doesn't get very dark. So it's basically a light red. But we're producing a still rosé this year that'll come out in a couple of months. I'll be bottling that this week, actually. And then we have a still Frontenac Noir called Initium Novum, or A New Beginning, that is extremely high acid and bright and low alcohol, and sort of for those looking for a full-bodied red wine, this is definitely not it. But for those who are used to drinking like Gamay out of the Loire or Pinot Noir from the Loire Valley, things like that, then it kind of falls in that category. It's about 11% alcohol and lots of acidity, and we serve it with an ice chill on it. And it's a really interesting grape variety. It's got a lot of, especially from this vineyard, it has a lot of earthy, spicy, kind of savory character to it. So it's kind of like if Northern Rhone Syrah and something from the Jura had a weird baby. That's kind of where the wine sits. And then we produce a tiny amount of Frontenac Blanc that I wish we could make more, but our first vintage we made 4 demijohns, so basically 20 cases worth of wine, and it's sold out almost immediately. Frontenac Blanc is a beautiful variety with a lot of tropical character, but also really high in natural acidity. So it makes for a really cool, quite complex wine, actually. And we have, 2022 in Demijohn right now. We aged the first one about 18 months. I think we'll age this about 12 months on the light, sort of the fine lees, to give it a little richness from that. But then we'll bottle, and people keep asking me about it because it's the wine that we make the least of course, and it's also the wine that somehow managed to be the most delicious thing that we produce. So what can you do?
So on a recent episode, we won't be back to back here. Brady tasted a Frontenac Noir from Nebraska.
Oh yeah, awesome.
So we can have him tell you about that in a second. But I had one question: is how much is planted in Vermont? Because I don't know when the publication date of the wine grape book came out. Jancis's book with Villeneuve. Because Vermont did not make the top 5 in Frontenac planting. I basically read the entry.
I don't think we make the top 5 of anything planted.
Well, Indiana was number 5. So
yeah,
who knows?
I think quality wise, we're in the top 5 for sure. Quantity wise, Vermont has about 150 acres planted right now, which is like 2 vineyards, maybe 1 decent sized vineyard in California. So right now, that's actually kind of what I'm working on most, and crafting our business model for expansion. The number one step in that process is putting another bunch of acres under vine so that we have something to produce. Because I think the press around Vermont wine has been super positive and really kind of glowing, actually, which I worry about at this point in the game, because we are so small as far as the actual production. I don't want to get the cart before the horse, where everybody gets really excited about Vermont and then they are like, oh, but you can't buy the wines anyway. And then by the time we have enough vines in the ground, nobody cares. They've moved on to Idaho or Frontenac Noir,
Yeah.
And so, we're at 150 acres right now. And I think there's no way that we could sustain any sort of national presence, distribution wise, even though people keep asking. Which is a good problem to have.
Well, how much Frontenac do you have planted? Because I think within the top 5, it got down to like 7 acres was like number 5. So maybe you guys have moved into potentially top 5.
Nebraska was 14, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was like number 3 or something.
That's wild. No, we should. I got to give Jancis a call. We got to chat about this. But we probably have 3 acres of Frontenac ourselves. And the vines are probably some of the oldest because they were planted in 99. And so we're at like overall the average age of our vineyards for Frontenac itself is 22 years old. So, but we probably have 3 acres. I imagine Shelburne has a fair amount. Lincoln Peak has a fair amount down there, which is now part of Shelburne. Anyway, I think we're close. If we don't make the top 5, I'd be surprised, but no.
Nice.
Were these the style of wines you were drinking when you were in Texas, or like how did your preference change to, where you're at
Yeah,
now, or has it not changed really?
no, I mean, I would say I still drink a lot of the same things. I was introduced to Vermont wine with Deirdre and Caleb's wines from La Garagista, a really wonderful producer down in Barnard. And they were one of the first producers that I tried where I got excited about the potential for growing grapes and producing wine up here. At the time, I mean, I in Houston opened a wine bar years ago where I wrote what I thought was a relatively progressive list. A lot of it was study material for myself, so classic producers from all over, classic regions, but then, some progressive stuff and some interesting kind of funky natural style wines. And what we found within 6 months of opening was that most of the people walking through the door were asking for more of the progressive producers. They wanted more interesting stuff, more off the beaten path varieties. And so I found myself relatively conservative as far as my own taste with respect to what people were asking for. But I think as far as what I drink, I tend to drink high acid, light, low alcohol style reds for the most part, and a lot of bubbly wine, and I try and drink as much Chablis as I can afford. And that hasn't really changed. I think with respect to what we work with here, I think the biggest challenge, and I think one of the things that we're all working toward, is how to produce wines that are as thoughtfully grown as possible, organically, biodynamically, sustainably, just trying to work, because that's very much the ethos of Vermont, right? It's 100% a state geared to that style of agriculture, if at all possible. It's not always possible, right? And then winemaking that is relatively hands-off and low intervention, which I've always supported in my own wine buying as well, whilst also making clean, accurate wines that are as free from, weird faults as possible, which is challenging. I mean, we have some volatile acidity and things like that, which I'm kind of like fine with to a great extent, a little bit of reduction, things like that. But we try to stay away as much in our own winemaking from, any Brettanomyces or acetaldehyde or any of the weird things that can happen when you're not sort of playing with your wine much. So I think those are big challenges and things that I've always kind of stayed away from in my own buying and drinking. But it's challenging in winemaking when you decide to go as hands off as possible to avoid some stuff. So it's been interesting.
Do you see more master somms getting interested in the viticultural side of things? Because I just wrapped up, well, I don't know if I passed yet, but wrapped up the diploma of kind of study piece and for the W set, and they focus more on viticulture. And I know the MW track, from what I've read, does. Yep. Traditionally, MS is less than the vineyard, but have you seen people kind of get more interest in that as the rise of organic and biodynamic has come on?
Somewhat. I mean, I honestly don't see a huge amount of that. And I think a lot of that is because the WSET program is geared so much more to all aspects of the trade, where the quartermaster sommeliers, we really gear a lot of what we teach to service and hospitality, which is a crucial aspect of that. And that's actually honestly the job, right? In most masters of wine, for example, the range of professions is much more diverse in masters of wine than it is master sommeliers, to a great extent, work either in distribution or in restaurants and in some form of hospitality. And I think as a result, you see fewer people moving into what is essentially an agricultural profession if you're doing it right, in my opinion. I mean, I think there are a few of my colleagues who are in winemaking, and some of them actually farm as well, but it's not a huge group of folks.
Yeah.
Did you pay much attention when back, I guess, well, you became MS in 2016, so I'm sure you started that journey well before then, right? So were you thinking too much about, am I going the MW track or the MS track, or did you just find yourself in CMS and just kept going? Like, how did that align with where you thought you would be at this point Would you have chosen differently?
I don't know that I would have chosen differently. I mean, the court really, the perspective and the work that I was doing at the time was so aligned with what I was doing professionally that people often asked when I was sitting the exam, it was like, oh, what are you going to do when you pass? Or what are you're passing the MS exam so that you can do, something else. And I was like, I'm not trying to pass this exam so I can do something else. I'm sitting this exam so that I can be better at what I do. And I found that most of what I was doing in my process studying for the Master Sommelier exam was honing the craft that I was practicing every day, whether it was buying, as a wine buyer, as a sommelier, as a taster, as a educator, all of those things kind of tied together. And so I think the MW program, and I have a lot of good friends and colleagues who are in the Master of Wine, either in the program or who are Masters of Wine. I always found it fascinating to taste with them and travel with them because their perspective on wine came from frequently a different direction. And I think we were tasting and talking about the same things, but just from different viewpoints. And now that I make wine and grow grapes, which is still weird to say, we've only produced 2 vintages, so I don't know. I'd like to say that I have a very long way to go in that process, but I think I've spoken with a number of Masters of Wine, and I've thought about sitting that exam just simply because, like, a lot of the material that I didn't have hands-on knowledge with, and I wasn't really applicable to what I was doing now is like my everyday life is talking about viticultural challenges and looking at international sales and the international market in a way that I didn't need to focus before. I mean, buying as a wine buyer in a single market, the international market matters, but it doesn't frequently affect what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So now, just looking at climate, looking at viticultural challenges in a fringe environment and things like that, like I'm constantly now, much as when I was studying, not to ramble on, but like much when I was studying for the MS exam, I was in it every day doing the thing that was going to help me pass the exam. And right now I'm kind of in it in the same way, doing the thing that would help me sit an MW exam. So, but when I was doing it early on, I didn't really think about it. It was kind of the path that made the most sense.
No, I think that makes I totally align with that point of view, because a lot of people in this diploma process too that I've been doing, they keep asking me the same thing. It's like, what happens now? What can you do? And it's like, well, and they're like, oh, you want a better job? I'm like, well, no, I get to buy, work with Adam and buy the best wines in the world. I mean, it's not much better, but it really does, like, it helps you narrow in, or it opens your eyes to different things along what you're currently doing that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise. So it's like, no, I'm trying to get better at my current job.
Yeah.
So very well put. I don't think I could have.
Well, I mean, sitting there studying, it was like, all the little baby wards of South Africa. And I'm like, when am I ever going to use, what am I going to do? And then all of a sudden something would pop up and I'd be like, holy crap, that wine looks amazing, and convince somebody to bring it to Houston. And suddenly we're the only ones bringing it in, and the sales were off the charts. And it's like, oh, that's why you study random stuff that you think will never be applicable, because it will actually, eventually it'll come around.
What was that wine, out of curiosity?
Well, it wasn't super off the beaten path, I guess, but I was reading, about in South Africa, Hemelanarda, and looking at the history of Hamilton Russell, and then the Crystallum project, which the original winemaker for Hamilton Russell, his son, was working on. And I was like, what is this Crystallum stuff? And these beautiful Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays that were not in the state, and then found an importer who was doing some really cool work in New York, working with some small production South African stuff. And then all of a sudden we had Crystallum Pinot Noir was crushing it for us. So it's fun.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I think for most, Hemelanarda is kind of off the beaten path. The only reason I remember it is because I think it's a funny sounding name, and it means heaven on earth in Afrikaans, apparently. So, I'd call that off the beaten path. That's cool.
It worked out, and then it's just you're reading up on family history and all sorts of stuff that directly influences the stories you have to tell in the business. So, yeah,
that makes sense.
How
does your train? Oh, go ahead, Brady. Sorry.
Go ahead. No, you're good.
Delay here. No, your turn.
All right. I saw we talked about this on a pod probably about a year ago too. Over at Tablas Creek, they're doing a rosé in like a 3-liter boxed wine. I think it's like their Patlin rosé. And it made me think when we were going to bring you on, I was like, are you experimenting with any kind of like, I know boxed wine isn't new, but certainly for higher end stuff off the bottom or above the bottom shelf is definitely new. Are you experimenting with any new packaging, canning your stuff, or anything like that?
We've looked at it a little bit. I think canned wine is a really interesting category that has a lot of challenges. I think that personally, I like it. I like the idea of it. I think that the consumer is about 10 steps behind the producers on this overall, because it is really hard to produce a can of wine that is going to come in at any sort of price that the consumer thinks is reasonable. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that anything in a can should be $1.50 to the consumer, and that's half a bottle of wine. And so when you're talking about a can, a 12-ounce can of any beverage, and suddenly it's $10, people have a really hard time spending that. And so that's, I think, the biggest challenge from my perspective on cans. Some people are doing it in Vermont. I think the ones that are financially the most successful are the people doing piquette, which is basically, for those that are unfamiliar, is adding water to your already pressed grape must and re-fermenting it to produce a low alcohol, essentially water wine. That is a ancient category that started in France for farm workers, but then got picked up by Wild Ark Farm in Hudson Valley, and it's become very cool and popular to do it. We make one. It's hard not to make one because you actually have invested all the time and money and effort into the grapes already. So why not add water to it and get another round of something, even if it's much less expensive, financially speaking. But that works in cans because you can keep the price down, I think. But it's really hard to do wine in cans. Kegging wine is not terrible. I think it's a little bit hard for consumers, but if you've got I find up here beer bars and places that have a tap available, it makes a lot of sense because suddenly they can put something on that doesn't go bad once they've tapped it. And whereas like most beer bars have a red wine and a white wine, and as soon as that bottle's open, they're probably pouring it down the drain if they don't have people drinking it fast enough. And so putting something in keg is kind of viable. We just haven't played around with it because we don't make that much. Bag and box and the box wine thing, I think, is again a consumer challenge. Just to find people who want to spend money on a bag of wine is tough. I would not be opposed to it. I just don't have any idea what that process looks like out there. I'm happy enough with our canning and corking right now.
Yeah.
And I don't know. There's a lot of discussion around environmental concerns and the glass industry and shipping wine and all of this sort of stuff. But I think it's a really tough bottom line to consider, and I think the math hasn't really been done properly on it. I think it's very easy to say that shipping glass is expensive, and that glass itself takes up a huge amount of space in landmines and things, or landfills and landfills and things like that. But I think when you start doing the math on the can industry, where they're actually not mostly getting recycled, and then what that production, the expense of that production, and the emissions produced, I don't think anybody's done a proper study yet on what really makes the most environmental sense at this point. If they have, send it to me. I'd be really curious to read it. I've read a lot of kind of like, Eric Asimov did a piece in the New York Times, and there's a bunch of kind of like, I think, pop culture discussion of it, but I haven't seen anything that really boils down the impact of each possible container. So
yeah, makes sense. Yeah, I know too. If I think there's some is there a cidery on the property that you're producing on, or are they growing apples or any other kind of fruit there? I thought that was maybe part of our discussion from last time. Is cider any part of your guys' experience up there?
don't produce cider right now. There are a bunch of people up here who do.
Okay.
And then there's a lot of co-fermentation, and we might have discussed this actually. There's a lot of people co-fermenting cider and grapes, and or apples and grapes, and co-fermenting apples and plums. A lot of that sort of work going on, which I think is fun, and I think there's a lot of really delicious things coming out. That's another challenge, I think, as far as the consumer mindset, as far as with respect to the price per bottle. Because cider, it's really hard to ask for more than $20 a bottle of cider. Well,
Yeah.
Yeah.
On the other, going back to the sustainability for a second, I wrote my diploma paper on sustainability and kind of gotten obsessed with like bottle weights since then. And I've been like I have a kitchen scale where I weigh every bottle now, and I'm like recording it. in theory, if I ever get accepted to the Master of Wine program, that might be my research paper. But like the different containers is really interesting to me. And then they do all have their pluses and minuses. I've seen the smaller cans now is what something people are trying to do, because it's not like a half bottle. But considering the like greenhouse emissions and the impact on the environment all the way through the supply chain is wild. Most people don't think about that. Or like when like how much a really heavy bottle from like a sparkling from like South Africa takes to get to me, as opposed to like, some other type of wine. It's crazy how that adds up over like the whole journey when like you have 100 grams difference in bottle weight.
And then there's a lot of folks who are shipping wine around the world in bulk and bottling when they get to location, right? And that happened a lot with people, especially with the tariffs over the past, in 2020, 2021, the huge European tariff situation. People started shipping in a massive amount of bulk wine and bottling here to save themselves money on the tariffs, and that became actually a pretty viable way to work production.
Yeah, when I worked in Australia, our winery they made some really high quality, but a lot of it was bulk. And I used to have to like go in like shipping containers and like set up the plastic bladder, because they would like just pump it full of wine and ship it to Bali, because of like the Indonesian taxes on like bottling there was fine. But if we were to send bottled goods there, it would have been like
100%
way more expensive.
It's interesting.
It's crazy. Well, pivoting a little bit, since we've been holding you already for almost 40 minutes, you had to reclaim an unpruned vineyard. And I mentioned a little bit about this before the call, but so there's a community garden farm. It has chickens, has some produce. And I've walked by, and for a while I kept looking at the leaves, and I'm like, those are definitely grape leaves, like in the summertime. And then at the very end, I saw little bunches, little white bunches. So there were two giant vines that have there were two. One's very dead. And now it kind of extends along a fence, and it's grossly overgrown. And the last straw was kind of yesterday. I was walking by, and it started a little bit of bud burst already. And and it's going to get really cold here. It's not good. So basically I'm like, all right, that's the last straw. I'm going to go and prune this weekend, because apparently anybody can just go in. So when you find a vineyard that's like completely overgrown, like what are the first, like, what do you do? And like, how does that help the vine kind of come back to production?
To be fair, the vineyard that we took over had been pruned the previous year, right? So we weren't just like, now the techniques used, and up here, there's a lot of viticulture where people are using multiple trunks, because at some point a trunk is going to die because of just the cold and crown gall and things like that. And so having a replacement trunk is important, but there were a lot. So we thankfully the next year weren't totally starting from scratch. When you've got a massive vine, I mean, the big challenge is that grapevines produce grapes on new growth. And so if a vine's been growing for a really long time and it's just sort of extended out, the bunches where it's actually producing grapes are really far from the energy source. They're far from the root, which is why, especially in a climate like this, we're doing what's called cane pruning. So we're basically cutting back the growth to 2 canes that are coming off of the trunk, essentially, or as close to the trunk as we can get them, because the old growth is what harbors fungal disease and a lot of the other issues that we have to deal with. So we're trying to cut back as much dead wood as possible. So we're cutting back something that at the end of the growing season is massive and has a bunch of different canes shooting off of it to just a couple of canes that are going to produce our fruit for the next year. If you're reclaiming a vine that's already been growing and hasn't been cut back at all for a while, you kind of, I would say, want to start just taking it piece by piece back to new growth. So finding a new cane that's a little bit closer to the trunk and then cutting off everything beyond that and leaving and cutting back a lot of all the rest of the growth. So it really focuses on those new canes. And then every year getting it closer and closer to the trunk. Because I think I've never reclaimed a vine that's been growing for like multiple years without any sort of cultivation. But my feeling is that much as we only wanted to cut back, one trunk at a time on the ones that had multiple trunks coming up, I think you just want to kind of keep moving back incrementally until you get basically back to the trunk so that you're working with new material every year that's going to put off grapes that are going to be worth growing.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think somebody cared for them at some point, because especially you can see the one that is dead. It looked like it was like a double cordon approach at some point in time. So like a lot of the overgrowth it's not new wood at all, but it's not as old. It looks like somebody actually was at least cutting it back every year, and now it's just maybe that person died or something. But
that happens. I mean, it happens.
Who knows? Maybe they could have moved. But it just seems like nobody else there has any.
I mean, I would go back and just find a couple of really good looking canes and then just really keep it sort of maintained back so that it's really focusing on its own health as opposed to just trying to grow. Because it sounds like it's just been let grow for a while and now it just needs to focus on production as opposed to just continuing to expand. But grapes are weeds. They want to grow, right?
Yeah.
Like they just want to, because if we didn't exist, grapevines would just spread constantly, putting out new growth at the end, right? Of whatever their shoots are going to. So.
Oh yeah.
So is the diameter really, really wide, Billy? Like how are you going to have to use a chainsaw, or what kind of method how old is this thing?
I don't know. I don't think it's that old. Like the roots or the trunk itself isn't that fat. That's why I think somebody was tending it for a while, because they are like maybe, I don't know, 3 inches across, maybe like at the main trunk, and it goes off, and then there's actual what appears to be actual canes. So I think somebody was tending it for a number of years, having it go out. And then I haven't looked at the very, very base and gotten in there, but the arms themselves are sturdy, but not like ancient. And it's not like too like gnarly or anything. So somebody was.
There's hope. You've got it, Billy.
Stay careful.
This is going to be the
vine. Get in trouble cutting down like the. Yeah, the only 110-year-old Chardonnay vine in California, and you chop it down. Gotta be careful.
that would be great. Yeah. No, I don't know. I tried to do like a little bit of amphilography. I think I can't remember what I landed on. I still have a photo to leave. Yeah. I can send it after this.
Awesome.
We can work our way.
It's Frontenac.
I mean,
some Minnesota aspiring 100%. Actor brought it out with
Frontenac's the New Horizon version in California.
Nice. Well, looking into 2023, you guys, so your company is called, or the wines, in case people are up in New England, are called Stella14, right? You want to talk a little bit about when you might have, where people can actually find them / what the name is again? Because I remember liking the story a lot from the name.
Our wines, I mean, really quickly, they're mostly in Vermont or online at Stella14Wines.com. We sell to a number of different retail shops in Vermont. We're also in a restaurant in San Francisco called the Barrel Room, and a small amount of distribution in New Hampshire. But beyond that, we just don't make that much wine yet. But Stella14 comes from the Stella Quartodecima was the original coin of the Vermont Republic. So it was actually like the second minted coin in the United States, predating statehood for Vermont. And Stella Quartodecima just meant the 14th star. So Stella 14, which you can't tell at all that this is a Stella 14 shirt, but there you go. So because it's gotten a little bit worn. So the coin is really cool, actually. And then in 2011, a bunch of school kids decided to petitioned the state government to add Stella Quartodecima Fulgeat, or May the 14th Star Shine, as our second state motto, which in a like classic Vermont moment, which I love, they petitioned the state government. This hit the press, and then it's kind of the dichotomy that exists in Vermont between a somewhat more conservative, right-leaning, agricultural, for the most part, population, at least, just slightly different than the liberal Vermont that most people would kind of think of. A number of letters went into the editor commenting that Vermont has no Latino population. Why are we even thinking about putting this in as a motto? And to which multiple middle schoolers responded in beautiful, beautifully written letters saying, "Dear, sir or madam, actually Latin is the foundation of the English language," and it's just these total sort of middle school explanations of how it was Latin and not Latino in root, and it was actually the foundation of our country in many senses. So pretty hilarious. So anyway, we liked all of those stories, and I think all of our fruit is Vermont, and the brand is very much based on Vermont history. So it kind of made sense for us. But I did love reading the letters to the editor. Were really hilarious and fantastic. So
we're glad that there's hopefully what's your plan for expansion and production? Can we look forward to more wine over the next 5 years? I would imagine so, but what's sort
our
of your
2022 vintage was pretty short. We got hit with a bunch of rain right in the middle of harvest, which is not what you want. And we had, at that point, I've learned a tremendous amount about viticulture in this process. And I sort of, both because of the lack of manpower and also just because we've been pretty lucky in the previous two vintages, left a fair amount of our canopy intact. So we didn't comb everything down totally, pull a bunch of leaves, expose all the fruit to the sun as much as we could have. And as a result, and we'd had no rain at all through the entire course of the summer. We were actually in drought. So so that all was going well, and the grapes were ripening at a pretty good pace, and we were hoping to harvest late. And then we got 4 inches of rain, or 3.5 inches of rain in a week, which was pretty brutal. So we ended up losing a fair amount of fruit, unfortunately, last year. So part of our plan for this year is putting in more hours in the vineyard and getting back to our previous yields, but then also starting to look at some element of capital campaign to put another 30 to 40 acres in the ground, which is a pretty involved process. But I've been working on that business model for a while now, and looking at how to scale our winery and scale our own vineyard plantings. And that's a big part of it is, when we sold grapes in 2021, we sold our entire production in about 1 week of shooting a few texts to people, because there just aren't any grapes in the ground, and people are not able to produce as much as demand has sort of dictated at this point. So, it's funny, a bunch of distributors reach out from New York, from California, from Texas, saying, "Hey, do you have wine? Do you have wine? Do you have wine?" And pretty much the uniform response from Vermont producers is, "I can send you a few cases, I can send you half a pallet," but there just isn't that much wine. And right now, supply has been wildly outstripped by demand. So we're excited to do everything we can to find acreage, which is another huge challenge actually in Vermont, because unfortunately with COVID, a bunch of people moved to Vermont and bought up a lot of acreage for second homes and things like that. And so now when we're looking for farmland that used to be relatively affordable, it's become less so and less available. But I'm excited to see what we can do. The plan would be to find land this year, prep it for planting, and then plant next year. So, yeah.
Nice. Have you, last we spoke, you were petitioning the government for something, some sort of more recognition for viticulture in general. So I want to hear more updates on that. And are there any plans to submit for an AVA?
So we actually have a petition in for the Champlain Valley AVA. That's moving into its final stage, and that's all. I mean, I really think the bulk of the credit for all of that, the heavy lifting, has been done by Ken Albert and a number of other folks. Ken Albert started Shelburne Vineyards, and Todd Traskos and a number of folks have really worked hard to petition for that. So I think we'll see a Champlain Valley AVA in the next 2 years, which weirdly enough we're a part of, just because we're on the Lamoille River, which is a tributary, and we're just close enough to kind of that area. But so that's in the future. I am now also the legislative chair for the committee from the Vermont Grape and Wine Council, which is somehow that happened this year.
Nice.
But I've been lobbying to sort of change some of our regulations with respect to production, and right now we're just trying to get like the ability to pour a full glass of wine in our tasting room and things like that. But I think we're going to see a shift in Vermont toward viticulture, because it's a pretty viable financial move in a state in which agriculture has been the foundation for literally hundreds of years. And unfortunately, dairy and a lot of the traditional forms of agriculture are struggling tremendously financially. So here's a crop that can be grown thoughtfully and organically and well here, and the return on investment is actually pretty viable financially. So we'll see. Yeah,
that's really exciting to hear about.
Awesome.
Baby steps.
Yeah,
there might be a play that you can make there, like champagne.
Trust me, there's been many iterations.
Yeah, there might be some unique.
Yeah, many iterations have been thrown around.
$95 a bottle.
Absolutely, 100%. Hey, supply and demand. There isn't much of it, so. The Cristal of the Northeast.
Nice. I like that. Sounds good.
No, we'll work on
it. David, thanks so much. We want to keep you all day. I mean, this is. I think we could go on for some time. A ton of insight. So we appreciate you coming on with us again.
No, of course. Thanks for having me back on. Congrats on all the success, and look forward to continuing to touch base. All right.
Sweet. Yeah, we'll talk to you again soon. Probably. Probably in 10 months.
All right, that was our interview with David Keck. I hope everybody enjoyed all of his stories and the efforts that he's making in Vermont to make their first AVA. And yeah, keep checking out all these natural wines, regular wines, any wines made from hybrids. Keep exploring. I want to encourage everybody to do that, and we'll be back with another episode next week. Cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circular as amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.